November 20th, 1943. Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. The invasion was supposed to be swift, a decisive demonstration of American amphibious power crushing a supposedly weak Japanese outpost. Instead, it devolved into a horrific, 3-day slaughterhouse, forever etched into the brutal annals of the Pacific War. The opening hours were catastrophic. Hundreds of U.S. Marines from the elite 2nd Marine Division, men trained for the toughest assaults, were cut down not on the beach, but in the shallow, deceptively calm waters of the lagoon, caught helplessly in a perfectly engineered Japanese kill zone. Their landing craft, the ubiquitous Higgins boats, LCVPs, that had carried them ashore in North Africa and Sicily, proved fatally inadequate. They grounded hard on an unseen, razor-sharp enemy nearly 1,000 yards from the sand, the coral reef. Admiral Shibasaki Keiji, the Japanese commander, had brilliantly anticipated this exact vulnerability, sighting his machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces to create interlocking fields of fire across the entire expanse of shallow water separating the reef from the beach. As the LCVP's ramps dropped prematurely, Marines laden with nearly 80 pounds of gear were forced into a desperate, agonizing wade through chest-deep water. They moved with torturous slowness, prime targets against the bright turquoise backdrop. Japanese machine guns opened up from reinforced concrete bunkers, their tracers stitching patterns of death across the lagoon. Mortar shells rained down, churning the water and tearing men apart. Hidden obstacles and shell craters became underwater traps, drowning those who stumbled. The few tanks launched from LCTs further out struggled, some sinking, others becoming bogged down before they could provide meaningful fire support. The first wave was effectively annihilated in the water. Shibasaki's boast that it would take the Americans 1 million men 100 years to take Tarawa seemed chillingly plausible in those first bloody hours. The Japanese strategy was brutally simple. Let the reef stop the boats, then massacre the infantry in the water. The horrific casualty figures from Tarawa, over 1,000 Marines killed and 2,000 wounded to capture an island barely 2 miles long, sent shockwaves through the American High Command in Pearl Harbor and Washington. This wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a potential strategic dead end. The entire island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, the essential path towards establishing bomber bases within range of Japan, depended on the ability to successfully assault dozens of similarly defended coral atolls: Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. If every landing duplicated the carnage of Tarawa, the human cost would be unsustainable, potentially prolonging the war by years and costing hundreds of thousands of American lives. The Higgins boat, the simple plywood invention that had proven so effective against the gently sloping beaches of Europe, was critically flawed against the unique geography of the Pacific atolls. A radical new solution was needed, and needed urgently. The Navy and Marine Corps had been experimenting with various amphibious vehicles, but none seemed quite right for the specific challenge of the coral reef. Tracked landing craft were slow and vulnerable in deep water. Wheeled amphibians lacked the traction to cross the jagged coral. The innovative duplex drive, D.D. Sherman tanks, equipped with inflatable screens for flotation, were highly susceptible to rough seas and required relatively calm water, a luxury rarely afforded in contested landings. What was needed was a true hybrid, a vehicle robust enough to carry troops and light equipment, armored enough to survive machine gun fire, capable of navigating open water like a boat, and possessing the unique ability to crawl directly over sharp, uneven coral reefs and transition seamlessly onto the beach, all while under enemy fire. It sounded like an engineer's fantasy, yet the conceptual ancestor of such a machine already existed, far from the war rooms and naval shipyards, in the unlikely setting of the Florida Everglades. Donald Roebling, heir to the fortune built by the engineers of the Brooklyn Bridge, was an eccentric inventor fascinated by the challenge of rescuing people stranded by Florida's frequent hurricanes. In the late 1930s, he had designed and built a remarkable vehicle called the Alligator. Constructed primarily of lightweight aluminum for buoyancy, it moved on cleated tracks driven by a gasoline engine. It was designed specifically to traverse the unique, treacherous terrain of the Everglades: deep water, shallow swamps, thick mud, and tangled vegetation. It wasn't fast, it wasn't heavily built, but it possessed one extraordinary capability. It could propel itself through water using its tracks, and then climb directly onto land without stopping or reconfiguring. Life magazine published an article featuring the Alligator in 1937, showcasing its potential for civilian rescue work. That article caught the eye of Marine Corps officers desperately searching for solutions to the amphibious assault problem. Initial inquiries were met with skepticism. Roebling's machine was unarmored, slow, and built with aluminum, a critical strategic material needed for aircraft production. It seemed entirely unsuited for combat. But the core concept, a tracked vehicle that could swim and crawl, was too compelling to ignore, especially as the limitations of conventional landing craft became increasingly apparent in early Pacific operations. Could this strange swamp tractor, born from a civilian need to conquer Florida's unique environment, be adapted, armored, militarized, and mass-produced in time to become the key to unlocking Japan's seemingly impenetrable island fortresses? The answer would require a leap of faith, a crash development program, and the transformation of a whimsical invention into a rugged engine of war. The ghosts of Tarawa demanded nothing less. The initial reaction from the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships to Donald Roebling's Alligator was lukewarm at best. Steeped in the tradition of designing vessels specifically for the harsh marine environment, the naval architects viewed the lightweight, aluminum-hulled swamp tractor with deep skepticism. It lacked a conventional keel, its freeboard seemed dangerously low for open water, and its track-based propulsion system appeared inefficient compared to propellers. More damningly, it was completely unarmored and built using a strategic material desperately needed for aircraft production. In early evaluations, it was dismissed as a fascinating novelty, but fundamentally unsuitable for military service. However, the Marine Corps, facing the immediate, bloody reality of amphibious assaults, was far more receptive. Visionaries like Lieutenant General Holland M. S. Howlin' Mad Smith recognized the Alligator's unique potential to solve the reef problem. They weren't looking for a perfect naval vessel, they were looking for a battlefield tool that could bridge the deadly gap between the LCVPs and the beach. Intense lobbying from the Marines, combined with the growing urgency following early Pacific losses, eventually convinced the Navy to fund further development, albeit with significant modifications. The first critical change demanded by the military was a shift from lightweight aluminum to steel construction. While this added significant weight, compromising the Alligator's impressive buoyancy, it was non-negotiable for a combat vehicle. Steel offered basic ballistic protection against small arms fire and shrapnel, and more importantly, it was a readily available material suitable for mass production using standard industrial techniques. Roebling initially resisted, concerned that the added weight would ruin his vehicle's amphibious performance, but the military imperative won out. The second major modification involved adding basic armor plating around the crew and troop compartments. This wasn't heavy tank armor, but typically quarter-inch to half-inch steel plate, sufficient to stop rifle bullets and shell fragments, the primary threats during the chaotic transition from water to land. This further increased the weight, demanding upgrades to the suspension and engine. Perhaps the most significant design change driven by military requirements was the need for a rear ramp. Roebling's original Alligator was designed for rescuing people from the water or swamps. Troops simply climbed over the sides. For an assault vehicle, however, rapid egress under fire was essential. The addition of a stern ramp, allowing troops or even a jeep to exit quickly once the vehicle hit the beach, transformed the LVT, landing vehicle tracked, the official military designation, from a simple transport into a genuine assault platform. Designing a reliable, watertight ramp mechanism for a tracked vehicle that operated in both water and land environments was a significant engineering challenge, requiring compromises between amphibious performance and tactical utility. This development process highlighted a fundamental clash between Roebling's civilian rescue focus and the military's brutal assault requirements. Roebling envisioned a light, nimble machine. The military needed a rugged, armored workhorse capable of surviving enemy fire. The resulting LVT was inevitably a compromise, heavier and slower in the water than the original Alligator, but significantly more capable of surviving the battlefield. Mass production presented another hurdle. Roebling's workshop was essentially a custom fabrication facility incapable of producing the thousands of vehicles needed. The Navy turned to an unlikely partner, the Food Machinery Corporation, FMC of California, a company whose primary expertise lay in building agricultural equipment like sprayers and canning machinery. FMC, like many American civilian companies, possessed the industrial know-how for mass production using steel fabrication, welding, and assembly line techniques. They took Roebling's core design, adapted it for steel construction and military requirements, and applied their expertise in efficient manufacturing. The speed of this transition was remarkable, driven by the desperate urgency of the Pacific War. The first military prototype, the LVT-1, entered service in 1941, still largely resembling Roebling's unarmored Alligator but built of steel. Following the lessons learned at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, development accelerated dramatically. The LVT-2 Water Buffalo incorporated better armor and suspension. Critically, the LVT-A-1, an armored variant equipped with a 37mm cannon turret derived from the M3 Stuart light tank, transformed the vehicle from a troop carrier into a genuine amphibious light tank, capable of providing its own fire support during the landing. By late 1943, as the lessons of Tarawa were being grimly absorbed, FMC and other manufacturers were churning out thousands of these tracked amphibians. They were still relatively slow in the water, around 6 knots, noisy and mechanically complex compared to simple landing craft, but they possessed the one capability that mattered above all else, the ability to crawl over coral reefs. Their wide tracks distributed their weight effectively, allowing them to traverse obstacles that stopped wheeled vehicles or conventional boats. The Japanese High Command, still focused on fortifying deep-water ports and assuming the Americans were reliant on traditional landing craft, remained largely unaware of the scale and potential impact of this rapidly expanding fleet of reef-crawling tractors. The stage was set for the next phase of the island-hopping campaign, where the LVT, the unlikely offspring of a swamp rescue vehicle, would become the key to unlocking Japan's island fortresses. The bloody lessons of Tarawa hung heavy over the planning for the next major offensive in the Central Pacific, Operation Flintlock, the invasion of the Marshall Islands, scheduled for January 1944. The primary targets, Kwajalein and Roy Namur, were classic coral atolls, defended by veteran Japanese troops dug into formidable fortifications. Critically, both islands were ringed by the same treacherous coral reefs that had turned the Tarawa Lagoon into a death trap. Failure here was not an option. The entire island-hopping strategy depended on finding a way to overcome the reef defense. This time, the American battle plan placed its faith squarely on the shoulders of the previously unproven landing vehicle tracked, the LVT. Intelligence confirmed that the Japanese garrisons in the Marshalls, while perhaps not as numerous as Tarawa's defenders, had replicated the same defensive strategy, heavily fortified positions sited to command the likely landing beaches, assuming that assaulting troops would be forced into a slow, vulnerable wade across the reef flats. Anti-boat obstacles were seated in the shallows, machine gun nests covered the approaches, and artillery was pre-registered on the reef line itself. The Japanese command remained confident that the coral provided an insurmountable natural barrier against a direct armored assault. The American plan for Kwajalein was a radical departure from Tarawa. Instead of relying solely on Higgins boats to ferry infantry, the initial assault waves would consist almost entirely of LVTs. Hundreds of the newly produced LVT-1s, still largely unarmored Alligators, and the improved, slightly better protected LVT-2 water buffaloes were allocated to the invasion force. Crucially, the plan also included significant numbers of the LVT-A1 AM tanks, the armored version equipped with the 37mm cannon, tasked with providing direct fire support during the treacherous transit from the transport ships to the beach. The concept was simple. The LVTs would swim from the transports, crawl directly over the reef, bypass the deadly shallows where the Marines had died at Tarawa, and deposit the assault troops directly onto, or even slightly inland from, the beach edge. The Higgins boats would follow later, bringing in heavier equipment once the beachhead was secured. The tension on the morning of January 31, 1944, as the first waves of LVTs churned towards Kwajalein's beaches, was immense. This was the moment of truth. Would the swamp tractors, heavier now with steel hulls and armor, successfully navigate the open ocean swells? Would their tracks grip the sharp, uneven coral of the reef? Would they survive the Japanese defensive fire during the approach? As the LVTs reached the reef line, the point where the LCVPs would have grounded, the difference became immediately apparent. Instead of stopping, the tracked vehicles lurched upwards slightly, their engines straining, and began to crawl, grinding and clattering, directly over the submerged coral. They bucked and pitched on the uneven surface, throwing spray, but they kept moving forward, bypassing the underwater obstacles and the pre-sighted Japanese kill zones in the deeper lagoon. From the Japanese defenders' perspective, it must have been a shocking, almost unbelievable sight. The expected lines of waiting infantry, easy targets in the shallow water, simply didn't materialize. Instead, dozens of strange, tracked metal boxes were emerging directly from the surf, crawling onto the beach like unstoppable mechanical sea creatures, disgorging heavily armed Marines right at the edge of their defenses. The LVT-A1 AM tanks immediately opened fire with their cannons and machine guns, suppressing Japanese positions even as they rolled ashore. The contrast with Tarawa was immediate and dramatic. While casualties were still significant, assaulting any fortified beach is inherently bloody, the catastrophic losses suffered in the water at Tarawa were largely avoided. The LVTs delivered the first waves relatively intact, allowing the Marines to quickly establish a foothold and begin assaulting the Japanese bunkers. The speed of the beachhead consolidation was dramatically faster. Tanks brought ashore by later waves of LCTs docking directly onto LVT-cleared beach sections were able to move inland and support the infantry far sooner than at Tarawa. Operation Flintlock was a resounding success, capturing Kwajalein and Roy Namur with far fewer casualties and in significantly less time than anticipated. While superior naval bombardment and improved tactics played a role, the decisive factor in overcoming the reef defense was undoubtedly the LVT. The vehicle conceived in the Florida swamps had proven its worth on the coral battlegrounds of the Pacific. It demonstrated that American ingenuity could find unconventional solutions to seemingly insurmountable problems. The Japanese strategy of relying on the reef as an impassable barrier was broken. The reef-crawling tractor had smashed the fortress, not through brute force alone, but through its simple, unique ability to ignore the obstacle that was supposed to guarantee victory. The path deeper into the Central Pacific was now open. The overwhelming success of the LVTs in Operation Flintlock silenced the remaining skeptics and cemented the vehicle's role as the indispensable tool for amphibious assaults in the Pacific. The lessons learned at Kwajalein were immediately incorporated into planning for subsequent operations, and the demand for LVTs skyrocketed. Production at FMC and other contracted manufacturers like BorgWarner and Graham Page ramped up dramatically. What had started as a niche vehicle became a cornerstone of American naval strategy, transforming the very nature of island warfare. The engineers, now fully backed by the military command, began rapidly iterating on the design, creating specialized variants to address specific battlefield needs. The initial LVT-1 and LVT-2 were primarily troop carriers, lightly armored and armed only with machine guns. While effective at getting infantry ashore, they lacked the firepower to suppress heavy fortifications or engage enemy armor. The LVT-A1 tank, with its Stuart tank turret, provided a partial solution, but its 37mm gun was already becoming obsolete against improved Japanese defenses. This led to the development of the LVT-A4, a far more potent fire support variant. Recognizing that the primary threat during the initial landing phase was often entrenched infantry and anti-tank guns rather than enemy tanks, engineers replaced the 37mm turret with a modified open-top turret housing a powerful 75mm howitzer, the same gun used in early M4 Sherman models. This transformed the Amtrak into a mobile amphibious assault gun, capable of delivering devastating high-explosive fire directly onto Japanese bunkers and strongpoints as it approached and crossed the beach. The LVT-A4 became the workhorse fire support vehicle for countless landings, providing crucial close-range bombardment that often suppressed enemy defenses just long enough for the infantry carrying LVTs to disgorge their troops. Simultaneously, improvements were made to the basic troop-carrying models. The LVT-4, introduced in late 1943 and widely used from the Mariana Islands campaign onwards, incorporated the most significant design change, moving the engine forward and installing a large rear ramp. This seemingly obvious modification, initially resisted due to concerns about engine placement and weight distribution, revolutionized the vehicle's tactical utility. Troops could now exit directly onto the beach under the relative cover of the vehicle's hull, rather than clambering over the sides exposed to enemy fire. The ramp also allowed the LVT-4 to carry small vehicles like jeeps or light artillery pieces directly ashore, dramatically increasing the speed at which heavy equipment could be deployed in the critical opening moments of an invasion. These continuous improvements reflected the American industrial philosophy of rapid iteration and adaptation based on battlefield feedback. Unlike the German system, which often focused on developing entirely new, complex vehicles, the American approach frequently involved modifying and upgrading existing, proven platforms. The LVT, originally a simple swamp tractor, evolved through a series of incremental but crucial changes into a diverse family of amphibious assault vehicles, each tailored for a specific role, but sharing common, mass-produced components. This proliferation of LVTs fundamentally changed the visual and tactical landscape of Pacific landings. Instead of lines of vulnerable Higgins boats stopping at the reef, invasion fleets now launched waves of tracked amphibians churning towards the shore. The sight of hundreds of these vehicles, troop carriers, fire support platforms, command vehicles, even specialized demolition carriers, swimming through the ocean, crawling over the coral, and driving directly onto the beach became the defining image of American amphibious power. Japanese defenders, who had initially perfected their anti-boat defenses based on the limitations of conventional landing craft, were forced to completely rethink their strategies. The LVT rendered their carefully placed reef obstacles largely irrelevant. Their beach defenses, once formidable, were now directly assaulted by armored vehicles emerging straight from the surf. They were fighting an enemy that had effectively erased the boundary between sea and land, using a machine born from the swamps of Florida. The reef-crawling tractor had not just solved a tactical problem, it had created an entirely new form of amphibious warfare that the Japanese military machine struggled to counter. By the time the U.S. Marines prepared to assault the Mariana Islands in mid-1944, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, the landing vehicle tracked was no longer an experimental curiosity or a specialized solution. It had become the absolute standard for the initial amphibious assault wave, the primary tool for overcoming Japan's increasingly fanatical island defenses. The bloody lessons of Tarawa had been learned, and the industrial might of the United States, channeled through companies like FMC, was now producing LVTs by the thousands, transforming amphibious doctrine from a desperate gamble into a brutal, methodical science. The invasions of Saipan and Peleliu were horrific, grinding battles, marked by ferocious Japanese resistance that often fought literally to the last man. But the initial landings, while still costly, did not repeat the waterborne massacre of Tarawa. Waves upon waves of LVTs, troop carriers, LVT-2s, and the newer LVT-4s with their crucial rear ramps, and fire support AM tanks, LVTA-1s and the powerful 75mm howitzer-armed LVTA-4s, churned across the reefs and lagoons, delivering Marines directly onto the beaches under covering fire. The AM tanks proved particularly vital, acting as mobile artillery, blasting Japanese pillboxes and machine gun nests at point-blank range even before the main force of Sherman tanks could be brought ashore. The sheer scale of LVT deployment was staggering. For major invasions like Iwo Jima or Okinawa, hundreds of LVTs would participate in the initial assault waves, forming a continuous conveyor belt of men and materiel from the transport ships to the contested shoreline. This mass deployment was only possible due to the LVT's inherent design philosophy, relatively simple steel construction suitable for rapid assembly line production. While German engineers focused on perfecting small numbers of complex heavy tanks, American industry applied automotive principles to churn out vast quantities of these comparatively simple amphibious vehicles. By the war's end, over 18,000 LVTs of various models would be produced, a number that dwarfed the production of almost any single German armored vehicle type. This industrial superiority created a tactical advantage that Japanese defenders simply could not counter effectively. Their fixed coastal defenses, designed to stop conventional landing craft at the reef line, were bypassed. Their beach obstacles were often crushed or driven over by the tracked vehicles. Their initial defensive line, often placed right at the high water mark, found itself immediately engaged by armored vehicles emerging directly from the surf. While Japanese anti-tank guns could certainly destroy LVTs, which were still only lightly armored compared to tanks, the sheer number of vehicles hitting the beach simultaneously often overwhelmed the defenders' capacity to engage them all. Furthermore, the LVT's versatility extended beyond the initial assault. Once ashore, these tracked vehicles proved surprisingly capable of navigating the soft sand, mud, and rough terrain inland, often serving as makeshift armored personnel carriers, supply transports, or command vehicles in areas inaccessible to wheeled trucks or even standard tanks. The LVT-4, with its rear ramp, was particularly useful for ferrying vital supplies like ammunition, water, and medical equipment directly from landing ships across the beach and up to the front lines, bypassing destroyed roads or congested beach exits. They became the logistical backbone of the beachhead in the critical hours and days after the landing. Japanese technical intelligence did capture and examine LVTs, recognizing their capability. However, Japan lacked the industrial base, the raw materials, particularly steel, and the time to develop and mass-produce an effective counter or equivalent vehicle. Their response remained largely reactive and tactical, relying on mines, well-sighted anti-tank guns, and desperate suicide attacks, rather than a strategic counter to the LVT's core advantage. They were fighting a 1940s war against a logistical and industrial machine that was already operating on a 1950s scale, powered by simple, adaptable machines like the LVT. The swamp tractor, born from civilian necessity, had become the standardized, indispensable engine of America's relentless amphibious advance across the Pacific. The success of the LVT in the Marshalls and Marianas solidified its position, but it was the subsequent, even bloodier campaigns for Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa that truly demonstrated its indispensable nature and the scale of its deployment. These battles represented the apex of Japanese defensive strategy, deeply entrenched positions, fanatical resistance, and terrain designed to inflict maximum casualties on attackers. Against these near-suicidal defenses, the LVT became more than just a landing vehicle. It became the workhorse of the entire beachhead operation, the logistical linchpin that allowed the Marines to sustain their brutal inch-by-inch advance. On Iwo Jima, the black volcanic ash beaches proved treacherous not only for wheeled vehicles but even for standard tanks. The LVTs, however, with their wide tracks designed for swampy terrain, often provided the only reliable means of transport across the soft, shifting surface. Waves of LVT-4s, protected by the LVTA-4 AM tanks providing direct fire support, became a continuous conveyor belt, ferrying ammunition, water, medical supplies, and reinforcements from the ships directly to the front lines, fighting just yards inland. Critically, they also served as makeshift ambulances, carrying wounded Marines back to the relative safety of the landing ships under fire, a role that saved countless lives. The image of LVTs churning through the black sand under a sky thick with naval gunfire smoke became synonymous with the brutal fight for Iwo Jima. Okinawa presented a different challenge, a larger island with more varied terrain, including muddy fields and rivers, alongside the expected coastal defenses. Here, the LVT's amphibious capability proved crucial even after the initial landings. As Marines pushed inland, they frequently encountered water obstacles or heavily damaged infrastructure that halted trucks and tanks. LVTs were often called forward to ferry troops across rivers, establish bridgeheads, or deliver supplies to cut off units. Their ability to operate seamlessly across water, mud, and moderately rough terrain made them uniquely suited to the chaotic, unpredictable nature of the island fighting. The sheer number of LVTs deployed in these later battles was a testament to American industrial might. While Japan struggled to replace its losses in aircraft and ships, the U.S. was flooding the Pacific with these relatively simple, mass-produced amphibians. For the Okinawa landings, the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, over 1,200 LVTs participated in the initial assault waves, an unimaginable concentration of amphibious force that simply overwhelmed the Japanese coastal defenses through saturation. Japanese intelligence, while aware of the LVT's existence, seemed unable to grasp the scale of its production or the flexibility of its deployment. Their defensive strategies often remained focused on stopping conventional landing craft at the water's edge or concentrating anti-tank defenses along predictable road networks. They were consistently surprised by the ability of LVTs to appear in unexpected locations, bypass obstacles, and deliver concentrated firepower directly onto their positions. Captured Japanese documents often refer to the LVTs with a mixture of grudging respect and bewildered frustration, acknowledging their effectiveness but failing to understand the industrial philosophy that allowed them to be deployed in such overwhelming numbers. The LVT wasn't a perfect weapon. It was still relatively slow, mechanically noisy, and vulnerable to heavy anti-tank fire, but its flaws were consistently outweighed by its core strengths: amphibious capability, reef crossing ability, versatility, and, above all, availability in massive numbers. It was the physical embodiment of the American approach to the Pacific War, applying overwhelming, industrially produced force directly to the point of Japanese resistance, using simple, adaptable tools to overcome complex geographical and defensive challenges. The swamp tractor had become the unstoppable tide washing over Japan's island empire. The legacy of the landing vehicle tracked is far more profound than just a successful piece of military hardware. It represents a fundamental victory of adaptive, pragmatic engineering over a rigid, fortress-based defensive doctrine. The Japanese High Command had staked the defense of their Pacific Empire on the seemingly immutable geography of the Coral Atoll, believing their concrete bunkers and the natural barrier of the reef created an unsolvable problem for any attacker. The LVT, the unlikely offspring of a civilian swamp rescue vehicle, proved them catastrophically wrong. The American ability to rapidly develop, mass-produce, and deploy the LVT family demonstrated a core strength that Japan could not match: industrial flexibility. While Japanese industry struggled to produce even conventional tanks and aircraft in sufficient numbers, American factories, leveraging the techniques of the automotive and agricultural sectors, churned out thousands of these specialized amphibious vehicles. This wasn't just about having more steel or more workers. It was about a system capable of quickly identifying a tactical problem, the reef barrier, adapting an existing concept, Roebling's Alligator, and scaling up production using non-traditional manufacturers like FMC. The LVT fundamentally changed the geometry of amphibious warfare. Before its arrival, landings were often funneled towards predictable beach exits or required the capture of deep-water ports. The LVT allowed assaults to occur directly across previously impassable obstacles, enabling flanking maneuvers and bypassing heavily fortified areas. It transformed the reef from a defensive asset for the Japanese into a mere inconvenience for the Americans. The cost comparison remained stark throughout the war. A single LVT, while more complex than a simple Higgins boat, was still relatively cheap and quick to manufacture compared to a fully fledged tank or a major landing ship. Yet, its strategic impact was disproportionately large. Each LVT that successfully crossed a reef potentially saved dozens of marine lives that would have otherwise been lost in the deadly way to shore. It turned near-suicidal frontal assaults into viable tactical operations. Post-war analysis confirmed the LVT's critical role. Military historians consistently rank it alongside the Higgins boat and the aircraft carrier as one of the key technological enablers of victory in the Pacific. Its influence extended far beyond World War II, shaping the development of amphibious assault vehicles for decades to come, leading directly to the modern AAVs, amphibious assault vehicles, used by the Marine Corps today. The core concept, a tracked vehicle capable of seamlessly transitioning from sea to land, remains central to amphibious doctrine. The ultimate irony lies in the LVT's humble origins. The machine that smashed Japan's island fortresses was conceived not for conquest, but for rescue. Its ability to navigate treacherous, obstacle-strewn environments was born from a desire to save lives from natural disasters. That this civilian-born ingenuity could be so effectively repurposed for the brutal necessities of war speaks volumes about the adaptability inherent in the American industrial and engineering approach. They didn't need to invent the perfect military solution from scratch. They were masters at taking existing good enough solutions and scaling them to meet the overwhelming demands of global conflict. The final verdict is inescapable. The Japanese fortress mentality, reliant on static defenses and underestimating the enemy's logistical creativity, was fundamentally broken by a vehicle designed to navigate Florida swamps. The LVT proved that in modern warfare, mobility and adaptability often trump fixed fortifications, and that the most effective weapon is sometimes the one that simply ignores the obstacle everyone else sees as insurmountable. The reef-crawling tractor didn't just carry Marines ashore, it carried the entire American strategy past the point of Japanese resistance.